So we're going to go now to Julia Long. She's from the UK, lesbian, feminist and independent researcher. She's going to give us a talk about the need for radical feminism in response to transgenderism, the shortcomings of mainstream gender critical feminism and the attempts to marginalise radical feminists. Welcome, Julia.
I'm aware that at these webinars, there's really a very sophisticated audience and well, not audience, participants with a very sophisticated knowledge and understanding. So I hope that none of this is in any way too elementary. But I wanted to give this contribution. It was kind of galvanized, I think, by a conversation that we had, Joe, between some of us around the response to Kathleen Stock's new book, Material Girls, which I think, to me, kind of embodies some of what I think of what are the problems with the mainstream in this country, mainstream gender critical positions and approach. But what I'm doing is giving a talk that I first put together from when we did that really enjoyable and memorable summer school back on Hampstead Heath, which I think was in 2019. I think I'm not sure. It was obviously.
Yes, I think it was 2019. We went onto the Heath and we had some talks on the Heath and some in a primary school 2 years ago. So almost now 2 years ago.
Coming up for 2 years ago. So I don't know. The landscape has maybe changed in some ways since then. So we'll see. We'll see if this still chimes with women here. So yes, I wanted to talk about the marginalisation of radical feminism from within the sort of mainstream gender critical movement, which I think brings about a lot of problems and definitely impedes progress. So I want to begin by talking about what a radical feminist understanding brings to the problem of transgenderism. And as always, radical feminist analysis begins with the understanding of patriarchy as a system of male dominance and male supremacy. So that's the starting point. So we then understand transgenderism as a form of patriarchy that introduces novel means of old stories, really, stories of violation of women's bodies, of women's spaces, of women's rights, of women's language and women's lives. So in some ways, it's business as usual for patriarchal domination and men's violence against women. But in some ways, there, as we've all seen in recent years, there is something new about it because it's actually men attempting to inhabit the word woman, or even a kind of simulacrum of bodies of women, and violators from that position rather than from the position of recognizing that they are men. So fundamentally, then it's about male power. And I've quoted this a lot. I'm going to quote it again because I think it's an absolutely perfect description of what transgenderism is about. As Andrea Dworkin observed many years ago, the first tenet of male supremacist ideology is that men have a self and that women must, by definition, lack it. That men have this self, men are the default human, and women are the absence or lack of that. And she goes on to say, it's a wonderful quote, but I'll just keep it very, very short. She goes on to say that his self is never big enough and hers, no matter how small, is always too big. So unto him shall always be given more and more, and unto her shall always be taken away, no matter how small this self is. And I think we see that, those words are so prescient, and we see that over and over again within this terrain of what transgenderism is doing. So obviously her words here have proved very accurate, and we can all think of many, many, many examples of exactly this over the past few years. And even if we just go back a couple of weeks, we can see, for example, that there is a man taking a woman's place in an Olympic sports team. So his self is expanding to that degree, whereas a woman, Jessica DeVals, has had her merchandise removed from the Royal Academy shop. I believe it's maybe being reinstated now after the sort of outcry. But we can see that where a woman says some, fairly, I would have thought once upon a time, fairly uncontroversial things about the nature of sex, that even that little, fairly innocuous statement means that her selfhood has to be diminished. And we see this over and over again. I mean, another example just from recent days is the cover of an academic journal. I'm sure a lot of us saw this really quite shocking cover of an academic journal called Transgender Studies Quarterly, showing trans activists posing very threateningly with knives and guns. That kind of image is disseminated on the cover of an academic journal with impunity, while women who accurately speak about the nature of sex are framed as committing acts of violence and could be hauled up in front of disciplinary committees, etc. So radical feminism, I think, is the only feminist theory or feminist philosophy which accurately analyzes what this is about. It's about the expansion of the male self through a will to dominate and a will to violate. What it isn't is, it's not a debate, it's not a dispute, it's not a discussion, it's not a scenario in which two sides both have equal rights that should be respected. What it is, I think we are all very clear about, it's a patriarchal war on women. That's what it is. And I think if you marginalize that understanding of the nature of transgenderism from your movement, from your activism, and from your thinking, then there are serious consequences of that kind of marginalization. So I want to think in this talk about the marginalization of radical feminist analysis from the gender critical movement in the UK. And I want to think about what that movement is doing, what it permits, what it manifests, and who and what it silences. Now, I do want to acknowledge that there have been some really very notable victories in the UK in the political and the legal contexts. I won't go through all the examples here, but just some of them are the fact that the Conservative government finally ditched the worst elements of GRA reform, although they did go through with some of them. There's been the legal finding in the Maya Forstater case that gender critical beliefs are worthy of respect in a democratic society. There was the amendment to the UK census after a legal challenge. There was by Fair Play for Women. There's been the case against the Tavistock Clinic that found that children can't consent to puberty blockers. There have been organisations dropping Stonewall as training as their contracts for Stonewall training with their HR departments, etc. So now these are, I think, really important, and I think they've all been very, very welcomed. They are very important victories, but I think they are still nonetheless really very limited victories, because actually, if we look more closely at what each of those involve, I'm constantly reminded of the Malcolm X quote that if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. So I think we can see that, important as they are, most of those, well, really all of those victories are within the context where things have got so bad that all they are doing is managing a bit of damage limitation, and they're not going. They're certainly really not going very far other than that kind of damage limitation. So what am I talking about when I talk about the gender critical movement in the UK? I think it's fair to say that in the UK, the early resistance to transgenderism was radical feminist in nature. So, for example, some of the writings of the journalist Julie Bindel in the early 2000s, certainly the radical feminist conferences and actions that took place from 2012, around about 2012 onwards, the Thinking Differently conference in 2016, and absolutely the influence of radical feminists who were then working outside of the UK context, such as Janice Raymond, Sheila Jeffries, Leah Keith, Mary Lou Singleton, others I could mention. So within recent years, really from around the sort of I don't know what we call them, mid-teens of the 2000s, there have been the emergence of some other groups. I think Transgender Trend and Lesbian Rights Alliance came out and were sort of developed maybe shortly before the others. The rest of them really have been coming out since September 2017. We've seen new groups and actors, individual actors emerge. Groups such as We Need to Talk, Standing for Women, Women's Place UK, Fair Play for Women, Resistors, Get the L Out, Save Schools Alliance, Sex Matters, many different groups. And obviously, last but absolutely not least, the Women's Human Rights Campaign. So many individuals and as well as these groups have got involved in writing and campaigning, and some of these have perhaps risen to more prominence and have become more well known. Now, some of these groups and individuals seem to me to be very much informed by radical feminist analysis and are coming from a radical feminist standpoint. So I would say Women's Human Rights Campaign, Lesbian Rights Alliance, and Get the L Out are very much informed, I think, by radical feminist understandings, and some of them are quite explicitly lesbian feminist groups. Others maybe are not, such as We Need to Talk and Standing for Women, but nonetheless, they have consistently created platforms for the circulation of radical feminist perspectives and analysis. Others, I think it's fair to say, have been at times dismissive and even hostile to radical feminism. And I think some of these problems are epitomized in the book Material Girls by Kathleen Stock and its reception. I should just say that list was that I read out of the different groups was kind of a list off the top of my head. I'm seeing in the chat there, obviously there are other groups, so it's certainly not an exhaustive list. And apologies to the various groups that I haven't mentioned. Why I think gender critical feminism that doesn't have a radical feminist analysis at its heart, why I think it's an inadequate response to transgenderism. I'm going to make a number of points about that now and identify some of the problems. I'm aware that in doing so, maybe I'm committing the sin of sounding quite negative. I think where I identify these things are shortcomings. Obviously, we can see the solutions are kind of embedded within what I'm identifying, but you have to identify it, I think, in order to see where the solutions are. Jo, could I just check? I forgot to keep track of time. How long have I got?
Well, we've got a little bit more time. I mean, you had lots of time anyway, but we've got more time because Mboni hasn't been able to come. So you've got probably 15 minutes.
Okay,
and then
perfect.
maybe
I can
18 minutes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think first and foremost, a kind of mainstream broadly speaking, gender critical feminism that doesn't have a radical feminist analysis, it fails to understand transgenderism as a form of patriarchy. And so therefore, I think there's a fundamental framing error at the heart of those approaches, which then leads to analysis and actions that I think are inadequate. So, for example, even this term gender critical, I think if we understand transgenderism as a form of patriarchy, a form of men's rights activism, men's sexual rights activism, we wouldn't use a term that is really as weak as gender critical. Because if we see gender as a political system for the subordination of women, I think we're a bit more than just critical of it. We don't see, things like capitalism critical or racism critical. We see things like anti-capitalist or anti-racist. So I think it's quite telling that that term has been adopted. And I also think that that term is a way of avoiding the direct naming of transgenderism, because it's a rather vague term, which, as I think a lot of the language of gender critical feminism is, it's a failure to name men as men, and we see this and a failure to name transgenderism as a problem. So we have this rather euphemistic language now of talks of critiques of gender identity ideology, as if, and I think that plays into what Stefanie was talking about, the true trans or true transsexuals narrative, that there is certain elements of transgenderism that are okay, and there are others that are more seen as extreme or more, extremist versions that is self-identification that are seen as not okay. And I think there's a very obfuscating language and a very euphemistic language, and that is very, very unhelpful. I think in actually kind of clearing, seeing the woods for the trees in terms of what we're talking about. And I have noticed over recent years the extraordinary lengths that so-called gender critical feminists seem to go to avoid actually naming men. So, things like male-bodied or transsexuals or trans women without the gap, these kinds of things. And as part of that, I think obfuscatory language, there's a willingness to use female pronouns for men, which was very evident in Kathleen Stock's book, and is evident in a lot of the groups. And I think all of this is obscuring obscuring the nature of what transgenderism is, and actually serves to kind of go on to my next point, which is actually facilitating and supporting male dominance. So I think one of the things that we saw quite early on is platforms being given to autogynephilic males, men who are presented as supposed allies. And I think there's been quite a lot written about this. So I'm not going to go into huge detail, but I think that has been a massive problem, and it continues to be a problem, even if those men aren't necessarily being platformed in the same way by those groups. I think at the various meetings and in terms of the language that is used, the men are there in the heads of the women panelists and the heads of the participants, even if they're not actually on the platform. And certainly some of those men have gone on to have, really quite celebrated roles and platforms in a whole range of other mainstream and social media. So I think there is a problem of facilitating and supporting male dominance, even if if that was quite an inadvertent consequence of those decisions. But I do see male allies as well being accorded privileged status, and I think what all of this has revealed, and is certainly coming to the light now in these last couple of years, is the lack of regard and the lack of prioritization of the experiences of the women who've been called trans widows, the women who have really been at the face of the abuse from autogynephilic men. I think that this also, this approach and this language has also meant that gaslighting women has become par for the course within some of these groups and at some of these meetings. So certainly what I've experienced at these meetings, it all feels quite a while ago now, because obviously with lockdown we haven't had public meetings for quite a long time. But I have experienced, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, I have experienced this sort of imposition of cognitive dissonance, where there's been a pressure in these public meetings, even though the meetings are ostensibly about women's rights, there has been a pressure to suspend your own disbelief at what you are hearing and what you are seeing in terms of the centering of true transsexuals, and to play along with falsehood, often under this sort of rubric of, we all have to work together, we all have to, we can take different approaches, but we all have to work together, which actually I find another really quite gaslighting term, to suggest that we should stifle our own very real and accurate perceptions in order to supposedly work together with those who perhaps haven't really given full consideration of the implications of what they've decided to do. And I think as part of this, certainly there has been quite a deliberate silencing of radical feminist voices and the voices of so-called trans widows, because these voices have had to be silenced in order to facilitate these male transsexuals who've been perceived, I think, really quite obviously wrongly as being allies. A few other points that I'd like to make around maybe the state of play that's around the kind of context that we find ourselves in, where we are obviously living in a very highly technologized and mediatized world, and much of the organizing is taking place. Obviously, there have been manner of public meetings and face-to-face meetings, but at the same time, I think the role of social media has become very central, and I think sometimes social media can be used quite irresponsibly to eliminate the voices that are maybe a little bit inconvenient to some of the groups. What I see, and I'd be interested to hear if others perceive this, I think obviously the media generally and social media generally really is very conducive to the creation of a kind of celebrity culture and a kind of cult of personality and status, where some individuals can kind of reach a status where they can't be criticized. Others seem to be criticized no matter what they do. And I think there's been the use of social media to introduce some of this celebrity culture within feminist organizing. And I think this really is very seriously to our detriment. And I do think the media context, the social media context, is very conducive to this. So I think there's the idea that that bigger is better. So, if you've got a huge Twitter followership, or if you can attract huge audiences, that is seen as somehow kind of better, irrespective of the content of what you're saying or the content of what happens in those meetings. And I think that has meant that certain voices have become elevated and other voices have quite deliberately been marginalized. And again, I can't imagine that I'm the only one who's noticed this, but I certainly see a scenario, a very, very oversimplified and wholly inaccurate scenario of kind of gods and monsters being created, or saints and sinners, where we've got certain individuals being promoted as they can do no wrong, whereas others are demonized and villainized as to they can do no right. And I think what's happening is there's a kind of a variety of identity politics that's being brought in, which means that we pay more attention to individuals and who is saying something rather than the content of what they're saying and how helpful or unhelpful it is. So I'm thinking in particular where certain celebrities might have endorsed a broadly gender critical position, there isn't always that much attention paid to what they actually have said and discussion around that, but there's a kind of elevation of that message because it's been said by a celebrity, and sometimes those celebrities are created within feminist spaces anyway. But I do see, and I certainly have been on the receiving end of some of this myself, I do see a culture, I hope that it's lessening now, of trashing and monstering certain women, and that includes radical feminists and some of us lesbian feminists, through things like trashing posts, pile-ons, ad hominem, or we could say ad feminem comments, name calling, actual shunning in real life and ostracization, and the deliberate erasure of women's work and achievement. So so I think all of this has contributed to some of the marginalization of radical feminist perspectives. I think I better move on, I think, a little bit. I better speed up, or maybe I'm going to skip this next section. But I think, undoubtedly, as I say, there undoubtedly have been very significant achievements, but I think we need to look at the nature of those achievements. And I think, when we are threatened with, really, really sort of desperately damaging legislation, then inevitably much of our aims are going to be reformist, because we're about trying to stop legislation or make, sort of reformist interventions. But I think there has been a kind of squeamishness from some quarters about more direct approaches, and more radical approaches. And so I think, again, that's to our detriment. So maybe going on now to think about how some of this is ongoing, and I think all the sort of multiple responses and a lot of discourse around the book Material Girls, I think has brought some of this to light, and there seems to have been sort of two phases. The first phase of very celebratory responses to Kathleen's book, and undoubtedly she was working in a very, very difficult context, and I think there is some useful content in that book, but it's clearly not. I wouldn't say it's particularly a feminist book. I certainly wouldn't say it's a radical feminist book. And in fact, what we see in that book is some combination of both very vague and unsubstantiated criticisms of radical feminists, along with some quite specifically disparaging comments about specific radical feminist positions or radical feminist work, but really no serious acknowledgement or engagement with the body of radical feminist work at all. And I think, again, I hope that that's something that we can all contribute to rectifying that. And I was very pleased that there have been another round now of critical reviews from Angela Wilde. I think it was in Lesbian and Gay News, and there was a very good review. I think it was on Medium by Daisy Haynes, and I also wrote quite a critical review, and there have been some others as well. Lily Maynard was kind of mixed, I think. So I would just like to end, if I may. I mean, I'm really throwing these things up as discussion points, and particularly given that we've had Stefanie's contribution of the work that they're doing in Germany. It would be interesting to hear, to see if we think these are quite common problems. I do think at the heart of it, this the misframing of what transgenderism is about, and also the attempt to accommodate autogynephilic men, I really see as being at the heart of the problem. But perhaps if I may just finish with an anecdote, again, to see if this chimes with others' experience. So I'd like to travel back in time, sort of before the lockdown, where I was attending a public meeting, one of the many public meetings about the harms of transgenderism. And it really doesn't matter which one, because I started to notice this was quite a common experience at these. The meeting might have been about the harms of transitioning children, or it might have been about the problem of men in women's sports. The topic doesn't really matter. But what I noticed was that there was a lot of expertise in the room. Both on the panel, there would be very impressive knowledge and expertise, and also in the audience. Experts from the fields of health, education, sports, biology, history, social sciences, you know, all kinds of experts, and also you know, parents with their expertise of rearing their own children. But what I started to notice about these meetings was that we were framing the problem as always being somewhere over there. It was always a problem that we were reliant on others to change. So we have to lobby, we have to try to influence, we have to try to speak out, we have to attempt to get others to change their minds and to change policy, to change legislation. And then there was often the question raised, how do we challenge stereotypes? How do we teach children that they don't have to conform to gender stereotypes? It doesn't mean you're actually the opposite sex. And it got to the stage where I'd be in these meetings with all of these experts, and then all of these kind of questions with our hands thrown in the air. And I would remember the words of a Croatian journalist called Slavenka Drakulic, in her collection Balkan Express, about the war in the Balkans. She wrote it in the early 90s, where she says, "We are the war, and I'm afraid that we cannot hold anyone else responsible. We make this war possible. We permit it to happen." And I would look around the room, and I don't know if anyone's going to agree with me, but I would think, we are transgenderism. And in saying that, I don't mean that responsibility. Well, actually, Suzanne Kapler talks about Slavenka Drakulic's quote about "we are the war." She talks about this in her book, The Will to Violence, and she says that doesn't mean that responsibility is shared equally throughout the society. She says, no, on the contrary, the object is to analyse the specific and differential responsibility of everyone in their diverse situations, and we need to hold the powerful accountable. But what she says is that our habit of focusing on the stage where the major dramas of power take place tends to obscure our sight in relation to our own sphere of competence, our own responsibility, and our own power. In particular, it seems to absolve us from having to try to see any relation between our own actions and those events, or to recognize the connections between those political decisions and our own personal decisions. So in other way, what she is saying is the feminist mantra, the personal is political. So to conclude then, what I observed, and I would be very interested to hear if others have felt the same at any of these meetings or in any of the kind of fora, we could say that everyone in that public meeting is doing absolutely everything they can to not make the war possible, to not permit it to happen. But as I looked around, what I saw going on visually in those rooms is often quite at odds with the words that were coming out of people's mouths. So we might all agree that sex and gender are different things, that sex is biological and gender is a socio-political system or a construct. And we might say ardently that there is no intrinsic relationship between the two. But what I saw time and time again was people in those spaces, women and men, acting as though there is a link between the two. And if we are consistently acting as though there is, and if we are manifesting that link, if we are bringing that into being, if we are behaving as though there is a natural relationship between being a woman and femininity, or being a man and masculinity, if that is the reality we are manifesting and we are creating, then it doesn't really matter, I think, whether it's inherent or not, because it does become real in the world either way. And I think for me, that is the fundamental problem with the orientation of almost the entire gender critical movement, that it's focused over there on the dramas on the stage, and it's less focused on how we are living our lives and our role in creating the fertile soil in which a phenomenon like transgenderism can take root and become as thoroughly invasive and hegemonic as rapidly as it has. And I think that only radical feminism questions this, and I think only lesbian feminism actively rejects it. So finally then, I think the unexamined manifestation of gender is, to me, one of the fundamental problems of the gender critical movement, which perhaps it turns out isn't quite so gender critical after all.